All right, folks. Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Huang. I'm a partner at Paradigm. We're a crypto investment firm. But today I'm here to ask some simple questions. I think the panelists here probably need no introduction, but maybe we can start with each of you articulating how you think about your role in your ecosystem. We obviously we're working with decentralized systems. I think a lot of people think of you as leaders in your respective ecosystems. How do you guys think about it? Maybe let's start with Zaki.
I don't know. I'm probably the newest to having a decentralized ecosystem that was live. Still figuring it out. I was very launch was my sort of thing last year, and early this year, and now it's sort of this like mass chaos of things that are going on, and like trying to like play a facilitator slash leader slash figure out how to go to market with IBC role right now.
I like the word facilitator. I think I've also used the word yenta before. Essentially, I meet a lot of people who are interested in building into Tezos, who are building on Tezos, and sometimes they'll reach out and say like, "Oh, I'm doing this. What are you thinking?" and so on and so forth. And so, I think the most useful answer that I can give to all of this question oftentimes is like, "Hey, this other person is building something similar or something complementary. You should meet each other." And so I do a lot of that.
I don't know. I do research. I talk to people. I do a bunch of stuff.
Thank you. So could we get a show of hands? How many people in the room are building infrastructure on top of or around L1? And keep your hand up if you'd like a foundation grant. Okay, talk to our panelists after. So maybe to kick off with kind of a simple question, how do you guys think about the most important or interesting infrastructure being built in your ecosystems today? What are some examples that you would highlight?
Most important or interesting infrastructure. In terms of like things on Ethereum that are immediately useful to people, like the mixers, Tornado Cash, it's still in kind of very early beta mode, but even still, it's like something. It's useful. People can use it, and now you can finally, for the first time, conveniently just move ETH to another account to pay for gas and do things from that account without linking it to the rest of your activity, and like gain more privacy.
Arthur?
Yeah, but so as long as you're building something on something, then it's not like layer one anymore. So it's like the layer one infrastructure is really the core protocol, and I think one of the things that's interesting in Tezos is that through the governance model and the fact that you can do binding on-chain upgrades, you have the ability to be to have a lot of innovation at a protocol level at a pace which is typically faster than you would have otherwise. I don't think the goal is primarily the pace, but it's a side effect. So among the things which are interesting, which are being built inside the protocol, so similar to what Vitalik was saying, privacy preserving transactions for smart contracts, and there's some very nitty-gritty stuff that I think is not very interesting to most people. You don't write whole papers about it, but making it faster to process transactions. For example, making sure that your nodes are not processing transactions several times, but only once. Making sure that you can create blocks without actually executing the transactions. Better I/O. It's boring, but if you look at almost every single blockchain out there, it's almost all of them are I/O bound, and just like having much better databases or disk access, this type of things is super important to have well-functioning system. And so it's not fascinating, but it is super important.
I think a lot about how to get like what stuff that is being built, how to get it launched. I think we do have a large contributor community, but like there isn't yet a well understood paths to like how do you like write something new for Cosmos and then get it live and value on top of it and like it working well. And I think that is a path that like we have to figure out over the next few months, and like sort of how to teach all of the different entities that are building inside the ecosystem, like how to launch things. A lot of them have been, building test nets for zones. Like there's a lot of activity there. And then there's like, how do you actually like adopt IBC is going to be a big challenge.
So maybe let's start with a question challenging the premise a little bit, which is if we think about two classes of motivation, I think you can think of some developers as more missionary. They're excited about doing the work, they're excited about contributing, and some developers as more mercenary, they're excited about building a business or earning something from their work. It seems like a lot of traditional open source as well as early cryptocurrencies benefited a lot from missionary work. I'm curious what you guys think of the question, do we need to think about incentivizing blockchain development, or is the missionary motivation good enough? Zaki?
So, if no one is paying people to work on these things, eventually everyone runs out of money, and like people have to eat, and this is critical infrastructure, and it can't be built in people's spare time, for the most part. So you do need to have like a contingent of people who are working full time for periods of time on these protocols in order for them to actually survive, and then there's the question of whether or not you can get rich building infrastructure, which I think is like a orthogonal problem, and I think there are opportunities to get rich building infrastructure, regardless of whether or not it's necessary.
So just to be clear, I mean, there are projects which demonstrate that just, traditional open source software has found ways of funding itself, but it doesn't mean that it hasn't been a struggle. So a lot of people point to the success of Linux and say, oh, look, it's just all volunteers and maybe a few people paid here and there by IBM, but by and large, it's a volunteer community, but it's, it is highly non-trivial, and you don't have the counterfactual, which is how many Linuxes, or I guess that's the plural of Linux. How many Linuxes would we have if there were more funding? But there's a deeper problem, which is I think you need missionaries in some sense, because it's always going to be a little more than just about the money. I mean, even in private companies, a lot of private companies are very, very focused on their mission, because otherwise it's hard to get people motivated enough or interested enough in what they're building in order to build something of quality. And there's the classic example is how early U.S. colonies, the ones which are very religious and which are going for very ideological purposes, survive better than the other ones. Or the other ones, maybe they were like, you know what, this is not a good environment, let's just leave. So you have necessarily going to have a little more success with missionaries. Ideally, you want to pay your missionaries.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna echo the boring centrist viewpoint and say it's a balance. If you just have missionaries, then basically what you've got is 3 guys in a basement, and they can build some things, but that's not enough effort to build infrastructure that's going to handle the load of and attacks from multi-billion-dollar actors. On the other hand, the mercenary approach that we've seen from some blockchain projects, cough cough, not this panel, have I think it's definitely there's definitely a lot of money being just burned there for probably very little impact, and because ultimately, blockchain projects are maybe 1/3 technology, 2/3 social, and I think I'm underestimating the social there, and you can't buy social, right? Like you can buy 5,000 people to come to your conference. You can buy like dinners with certain famous people, and you can buy some stuff. But it's not the path to strong and long-lasting sustainability, and it's also not the path to having making your missionary developers happy.
Yeah, I worry a little bit about if you have money to pay mercenaries, and so frequently mercenaries are very professional in what they do. You end up discouraging the missionaries, and that can kind of like undermine the long-term viability of the project.
Sort of crowding out.
I would also say don't knock the boring centrist viewpoint. It's a safe viewpoint. It's also oftentimes correct. The other thing is reflecting on why it's important to have missionaries, I think one of the main source of cost as well. There's the fact that blockchains are social. There's also the fact that anytime you're dealing with missionaries, it may be very professional, but you're going to deal with a lot of principal agent problems, and that's why I think a lot of you'll see a lot of money being burned if you're just trying to pay your way into doing this type of things. You'll get already selected by people who are going to try to get this money, and nothing will happen out of it. So it's throwing money at things is a much harder problem than it sounds.
So it sounds like there's some consensus that it is worth incentivizing infrastructure development. Let's take Ellie's framing from this morning for folks who missed it. Ellie had a framing of blockchain funding as sort of a government versus private sector dichotomy. How do you guys think about the role of the foundation or the governance, the government effectively funding infrastructure development versus private sector incentives?
So I guess, first of all, is the government the foundation or is the government the protocol?
Interpret it both ways.
And I guess that is true in some ways, because the foundation, and given pretty much all modern cryptocurrencies have pre-mines, the protocol does give a one-time grant to the foundation, so it's a state-owned enterprise, yay. I think the advantage that protocol funding has is that it can provide funding that is large. The big, huge disadvantage that protocol funding has is that it has a very hard time being credibly neutral, and whatever mechanism you have is going to get attacked. And mechanisms get attacked in lots of different ways all the time, right? And we've seen a lot of attempts by kind of wealthy actors to influence social layers of blockchains, and even things like cartels forming. So it's basically the challenge on the protocol side, I think, is basically figuring out a governance structure. And governance structure doesn't have to even mean like something perfect. It could even mean like very small components, like something like one very simple example would be if you come up with a mechanism where if you just write a contract and a huge number of people start using them, then at some point some portion of the transaction fees just get rebated to whoever published it. Like that mechanism is totally credibly neutral, but on the other hand it's limited. So there's a spectrum.
Maybe you could say a word on the approach of the Ethereum Foundation. It seems like the approach you've taken with the ETH2 clients and some of the ZK R&D work is different from the historical approach? Yeah, so I guess first of all, like Ethereum community has really pushed very hard on this approach of multiple implementations, multiple clients, kind of separating between like the specification and the implementation. And in part, this is a kind of redundancy for security strategy, and it has actually saved us in 2016 during the DOS attacks. In part, it's also a kind of political decentralization strategy, so to avoid one organization having too much control. And basically, for the first few years, what we've done is just the foundation supported both the clients, but now we're supporting most of the client developers with grants. And these are kind of independent external companies, and sometimes they get grants from other sources. And I mean, I think it's actually worked out even better than I thought it would.
Yeah. So in the main mechanism that's provided for in Tezos to provide for upgrade over the long run is something that's been dubbed inflation funding, and the idea essentially is you come up with a way of improving the layer 1 protocol, and I should say that it is focused almost exclusively on layer 1. You can do more with it, but it's designed for layer 1. And so you come up with a proposal, and a proposal is not just an idea. It's like actually a piece of code that's fleshed out, and you say, let's replace the state machine of the protocol from this old state machine to this new state machine, and you probably publish this on a website, and you propose a hash on the chain, and people can vote for this protocol and accept it or reject it. And the idea is, since you're changing the state machine, one of the things you can do in changing the state machine is issue new coins and send them to your address. And I think the benefit of this approach is that it is in some sense credibly neutral, in a sense of like you've produced a work and you propose it, and if people want it, you get your coins and then you walk home, and there is no further discussion to be had about this. If people are not happy with it, they can change it, but you know what, they had a chance. And so it ends the unless discussion, as opposed to funding, whether it's through a foundation or through a DAO. As soon as you fund things, people are going to start trying to think, well, is this a right way to do this, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of second guessing that comes after, which is very difficult, and the credible neutrality. The other thing when it comes to government funding versus private funding, it's that the funny thing is that it's a debate and a question that comes a lot in libertarian literature. And it goes like this. So when you start thinking of like the provision of public goods, the reaction among libertarians is divided in two. Some people will try to pretend that there's no such thing as a public good. All you need to do is to have a toll booth everywhere. And so, you'll have a private city, and then, in the streets, there's going to be a private toll booth at every part of the street. And then, privatize everything. And that doesn't really work well. There's a lot of friction. You can't really make that work. And so the second approach is to say, no, you just need to internalize the externality, and what will happen instead is that some developer will buy an entire tract of land and they'll have a private city, and then they can internalize all this externality and produce good things. And of course the question immediately is like, well, what is the difference between a city government and a privately owned city? At the end of the day, one is going to charge you taxes, one is going to charge you a fee. That looks very, very similar. There's no competition. And there's a good answer to that by economist David Friedman, which compares capitalist trucks and communist trucks. So you take a truck and I tell you it's been produced in the Soviet Union, and you take another truck and I tell you it's been produced in the US, for example. And they're both trucks, right? They both have wheels, they both try to do the same function, but one is going to work better than the other. And the general idea is that if the process that leads to the creation of your trust is a competitive one, is one where people opt in voluntarily, you probably are going to produce a decent truck, whereas if it's based on what is essentially amounts to forced labor, you're not going to have a very good truck. And so the comparison between the protocol or a well-known foundation, for example, being like a government actor has its limits, because fundamentally the fact that it originated from something that is voluntary means that there are very, very different outcomes that you should expect out of this process.
So I would say the approach that Cosmos has been taking is we are trying to create spaces where different ideas can be tried out. And Cosmos has a very pluralistic approach to basically everything. That's probably what defines the project. What is not Cosmos is unclear. But essentially what we are trying to do with the foundation is fill gaps where we think something needs to be done, and a rate limiting factor is funding. The foundation is able to provide funding there. There's going to be on-chain, like a small on-chain inflationary funding mechanism that emerges after the next hub update. But it's also a little bit unclear how we're going to interact with all of the things that are sort of like Cosmos, like all of the other PBFT chains that could easily support IBC that are emerging. But I would hope that eventually the importance of the foundation in the ecosystem is diminished quite rapidly, and that that there are primarily private incentives driving the system.
Thoughts on inflation-based rewards, such as the founder's reward or other models?
So basically, I think currently we have, I know of no scheme that satisfies at least my own standards of kind of security and rigor for being both credibly neutral and attack resistant. Basically, like there's the centralized scheme, which is like, hey guys, we love Zuko and he's like wonderful, yay, and we're gonna just like agree to pump some more money to him, and like that's. I mean, honestly, there's a very high probability Zuko is an attacker, so that's fine. But it's centralized and it's limited. And on the other hand, you have schemes that do try, and like also those kinds of schemes, like they can't, unless they're created like at the very beginning, before like when a community is still like basically below Dunbar's number, you start getting attacks. Right? I mean, even Ethereum, for example, there was this kind of working group that was trying to do figure out how to do issuance funding, and it kind of fairly quickly devolved into essentially people coming up with reasons why they should get more money printed for themselves. And as we know, other people's money, OPM, is addictive. Um, so, yeah, and it's hard. The second option is some protocol mechanism, but then, like, the biggest kind of big money example of this, EOS, it's as far as I can tell, basically devolved into a cartel of rich people bribing each other to vote for each other. So, yeah, I'm not diplomatic on stage, man. Basically, we have such kind of strong and rigorous standards for things like evaluating the security of proof-of-stake protocols, and like we've done a really good, Cosmos, like Tezos, Ethereum have done like a really, I think, good job of that. But like, decentralized governance protocols don't really seem to have kind of stood up to the same level of economic rigor, especially once you consider economic models that allow collusion between participants.
I think so. Just to react on the last part, I think the main thing is that you have to look at what is limiting the security of your system in general. And the problem is that the fact that the difficulties with decentralized governance and all of this, it's not a reflection on decentralized governance, it's a reflection on this entire space, because we have really nice guarantees around the cryptography, for example, and even some of the distributed system aspect. But at the end of the day, all of this stuff relying on honest majority assumptions. No matter how hard you try, even if you try to do something where I know that in Cosmos there's really this aspect on like being able to slash a very large number of the tokens, but at the end of the day you're still relying on some sort of coordination to restart after that and doing some hard fork and so on and so forth. So knowing that at the end of the day you're just all like trying to not have to bounce too often on a soft mattress of subjective community assessment of how things are going, trying to be far more rigorous than that is basically not necessarily useful. Like, you want to minimize reliance on it, but you don't want to fool yourself into thinking that you have some sort of computer sciencey guarantees that everything is going to be great. Regarding the funding, I think so. Part of it is human. Part of it is human nature. Part of it is bag shading, because that's going to happen in any human system. I also think that there are protocols which didn't get enough funding for historical reasons, and they have an incentive to create moral norms against any type of inflation-based funding or anything like that. And it's purely, it's purely anti-competitive behavior, which is normal, but like I guess the hypocrisy is a little annoying.
I would say that the governance experiment is very primary to what the Cosmos Hub is trying to do. We sort of structured the thing in such a way that governance was like upfront and very early on a significant barrier for like the chain becoming useful. And so it's sort of like, and now we've added this inflationary funding mechanism, which may or may not work but we want to test what is possible, and it is certainly true that we can't predict the success of these things in any sort of rigorous fashion, and what we're trying to set is a set of evolving social norms around it, and we don't know whether or not those will work out, but we want to put that experiment like front and center and learn early what does and does not work.
Maybe switching gears, when we think about sustainable business models for companies, I think it's often underrated how much business model innovation matters relative to product or engineering innovation. If you look at the traditional internet, annual monthly subscriptions really enabled cloud software, take rates on marketplaces, etc. I think it's clear that there are incentives to build a layer 1 protocol. You get seigniorage. I think there's clear incentives to build an exchange or a mining pool, potentially a validator. How do you think about incentives for businesses beyond those models? I think we got a taste in 2017 of what's possible if a lot of people think a business model is interesting. Today we know medium of exchange tokens are probably not sustainable, but long term, if this ecosystem is going to succeed, presumably we want long-term sustainable models for many businesses to grow. So how do you guys think about that? Maybe let's start with Vitalik.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some cases where tokens make some sense, and like the way that you, I don't think it's as bad as some people think. Like basically, like if you are making a token, then yes, it's backed by fees, but fees that you expect to happen within your own protocol. And one example of a place where it actually makes sense to do that would be basically layer 2 systems where you want the participants, the participants to also be people who would suffer if they act in some way that the base chain cannot detect that would make the protocol break, to add extra incentive alignment. And the reason it's not that terrible is because transaction fees aren't that low, right? So for example, the Ethereum chain to date, I think the transaction fees on it have been something like $250 million. So it's entirely possible to come up with protocols that given some assumptions about them succeeding and getting usage to a reasonable extent, like your ability to capture value out of that is not too bad. Now there are going to be some things where you can't make a this kind of protocol and charge for it. The idea that I suggested earlier of coming up with mechanisms where if you write a contract and lots of people use it, then you get some rebate. Even something like that as a protocol feature is something that could be worth exploring, and maybe we can figure out more kind of market-based in protocol ways of incentivizing development.
Token models, what examples would you point to that are promising? It seems like Joey made a case for the Augur token. The MKR token seems to have some.
Yeah, and MKR token has definitely been successful. There's been a non-negligible fraction of the MKR that's been burned as fees already. Yep, Augur seems to be working pretty well as well.
So there's a difference. So the difference between some of the tokens that exist on a chain, which can have their own existence, like MKR, for example, or REP, and the tokens for layer 1, because we're discussing layer 1. And to be honest, I think that it's, I don't think you can I don't think you can survive on fees alone, because I'm pretty optimistic about layer 2 solutions, and so I think at the end of the day, the only realistic way of success for layer 1 blockchain is to be cryptocurrencies and to be store of values and mean of exchange. So that's the first thing I am pretty convinced of. The second thing is that I'm also convinced that more or less you're going to have maybe not one, but at least an extremely strong power law in terms of which cryptocurrency dominates. And the reason is that they are for many users close substitutes to one another. Not quite. There are many cryptocurrencies that do things better than Bitcoin can do, but Bitcoin has much greater network effect. And so at the end of the day, I guess it's a bit of a pessimist take on on the industry, but it's a reality, and it's really hard to survive if you don't have a monetary premium, because otherwise what you have is you have network effect, and you have computation. Computation is cheap. If you're looking at the amount of computation you're actually buying by using a blockchain, you can, if you're willing to use AWS, you can look at the cost of running something on the EOS, for example, as opposed to AWS, and it's just orders of magnitude more expensive. So you can't really justify your fees like this. And you can have network effects. So, for example, I think the reason MKR might have value, for example, is that they are in a dominant position for people who want to make CDP loans in Ether on Ethereum, and as a result of that, they can extract rent. But as this thing gets competed away, it gets really hard to maintain any value. So. I don't think we're going to see more and more layer 1 chains being launched. You're seeing a whole slew of them, which have been primarily funded by venture capital and who primarily try to distinguish each other now by having a different consensus algorithm. It's like, oh, we have...
Don't they distinguish each other by having a different professor as the head?
Yes.
Go ahead. All I would say is, so I think, well, one observation that I think is interesting is essentially the conventional open source model is breaking down because so the assumption was that for a long time was, the business model was, oh, we'll develop an open source software, but we can operate the software better than anyone else, and that's why you would pay up a centralized company for their cloud services. But Microsoft, Google, and Amazon now operate anyone's software better than the developers, like they're specialists in operating software. And so the open source model has broken down. I think right now there is almost no expertise in either deploying distributed software or operating distributed software. And both of those seems to be opportunities to capture rents. And I suspect that that expertise in that space will be scarce, and provide some mechanism of sort of bidding between both the protocol and the developers to like attract the best people at building this stuff.
So one place for attracting rents that we haven't talked about that's smaller, but at least it's guaranteed to not go away with improvements in technology is domain names.
So maybe last question, because I think we're almost out of time. Changing gears a bit, what's something that you guys are thinking about or excited about that you think the other panelists would disagree with you on? Zaki first.
Thinking that they would disagree with me on.
For everything.
Everything. No, well, I would say probably the thing that I'm excited about is I am excited about like the many chain ecosystem that I think is going to be emerging. I think that like there's going to be a whole bunch of new blockchain protocols, and many of them will fail their go-to-markets, but even if they fail their go-to-markets, the software will be interesting and maybe exist in better token distributions. And so I think that that's a thing I'm pretty excited about.
So I'm excited about the prospect of having more complex and intricate rules for on-chain governance, in particular constitutionalism. So, which is the idea that it's not just, oh, you vote on a protocol, the protocol gets activated, but the old protocol can reason about the new protocol and check for its properties and then accept it or reject it. So it's basically treating protocol upgrades like you would treat a whole smart contract.
Homogeneous layer 1 sharding.
That's actually a good list of things because I don't agree with either of those things.
Perfect. It sounds like we have 5 minutes for questions, so if you can line up at one of the 2 mics, we'll take some questions. And maybe if there are no questions right off the bat, I can cold call Ellie up there. Do you have a question for the panel, Ellie?
There's a mic. Okay, I have a question. What about, governments often what they do is, they sort of do something like, for infrastructure, they run an auction and then give like limited license. So I'll give an example. You say, okay, we need 3 wallet providers. So we're running an auction, you can submit things, and then actually the governance will give you a license for the next, 3 years. You can extract from the layer 1. You will get some fee that will be sort of enforced in the protocol, and now there'll be 3 wallet providers, and go compete among yourself, and so on and so forth. What about something like that for sort of building, fostering infrastructure using private sectors? So
one example of a kind of implicit auction that kind of fully satisfies my admittedly tough standards for credible neutrality is direct in-protocol incentives for generating like Starks and other kinds of succinct claims about like basically validity and other properties of the blockchain protocol, because like ultimately there is like there's a lot of benefit that you could get from having like proofs that say that some block was executed correctly and some state transitions were done the right way, but these proofs are hard and especially in the case of general purpose VMs prohibitive to generate. But if you had some schedule of in-protocol rewards that you committed to, then you could incentivize an ASIC ecosystem to be created and developed. You could incentivize people to actually continue running the hardware. And this seems like something that actually could end up incentivizing quite a lot of socially productive development effort, but like, without needing to have mechanisms that could be are kind of overly subjective or could be captured in some way.
I think there's often a tendency to try to say like, oh, this will be the agreement and so on and so forth. And at the end of the day, whether or not you give, this some sort of exclusivity or anything like that, at the end of the day, it ends up being money, and it's just like with extra steps, and maybe that's not. I don't know if the extra steps add a lot to it. The thing that I think is important in terms of funding and which goes towards credible neutrality is to be in a to try to pull on the rope, not push on the rope, in a sense of like identify projects which are good, which are popular, which are well liked, and it's a lot more. It's a lot easier to notice this thing, and it's harder to fake, and then provide assistance to those projects as opposed to trying to ab initio say this is going to happen and then trying to make it happen.
I think part of the challenge is that no blockchain today is truly a natural monopoly. And as a result, it might be in the future, but at the moment it's not. In fact, they're all rivalrous with each other, and they're all substitute goods frequently for each other. And so the challenge that I would see with trying to grant any sort of exclusive license in that environment is it does create incentives for people to use the rival, which might be cheaper if everything is open source, and you have to pay this extra fee to use Starks on a Cosmos chain. There'll just be another Cosmos chain that doesn't charge that fee, and people will do their transactions there. And so it's a little bit challenging, at least at this stage, to try and make something like that naturally enforceable.
And I think it's what a lot of people tried with AppCoins. There was a lot of AppCoin model, which is, we're going to write an open source smart contract and deploy it, and then you'll use our token to call it, even though you don't need to. And it's kind of like putting a toll booth in the middle of an open field. It doesn't do much.
Sure. So basically the idea would be that, say I deploy a contract, and this could be a software library, it could be a copy of like an EC whatever verifier or something. And then right now, calling that contract has some gas cost, and there's reasons for that gas cost to exist. But suppose that in the case where a lot of people call the same contract, what you do is you would take some portion of the gas fee, so maybe up to 50%, maybe it's a sliding scale, goes up logarithmically, and you would basically just direct that to whoever published the contract originally. Now, there actually are already good reasons to kind of charge sublinearly for contract use, basically because if a contract ends up getting called often, then you could stick the code in a higher level cache, the Merkle witnesses could get smaller and blah, blah, blah. But basically what this would do is it would create this kind of natural moat where if you create a library that becomes popular, then you're getting funded, and any other people would not be able to undercut you because you're not charging a fee that's higher than anyone else. You're not even charging a fee at all. You're just getting money that's given to you by the protocol.
Yeah, it's tough to do anything with the fees because you always have to contend with the possibility that people pay the fees offline. And so, if you're just monitoring the fees and then minting money in order to do that, then the contract is going to pay fees to itself. If you're trying to have a burn that's related to the gas cost, That might work, but then people might spend the gas when there's very low demand and then do it for free. So there's always, I'm not saying it's possible to do it, but it's always very, very, very tricky when dealing with fees, you know.
So in this case, like the really important kind of mathematical point is that the return to the developer is, or the discount is super linear, so it starts off being 0. So basically, like if you're an upstart trying to compete and you're gonna say, hey, like I'm gonna give my rebate back to you by like paying you on a plasma chain or whatever, then like until you actually succeed, like you don't actually have any money to give the rebate with. It's not a perfect mechanism at all, and you can totally like do a loss leader around it, but it is something.
It does seem very interesting to try to figure out a way for protocols to incentivize people that are proportional and super linear to like some notion of like the economic value they generate for the protocol. And I don't have a mechanism off the top of my head, but I think it's worth experimenting with, because if you get it right, your protocol has a market advantage.
If it's a monopoly, but then someone uses another protocol and then has an ordinance and then has a copy of that contract, then you don't have to.
Sure.
And you don't have either like to pay the extra fee or the inflation associated with that. So that's but even the thing is like even for like a store of value, pure medium of exchange cryptocurrency, I don't think you can secure it with fees. I think you need some form of inflation to secure it. But then the strategy is that you can build a parasite cryptocurrency on top of it, which is only going to pay fee and not going to be affected by inflation. So even that like much simpler part of the problem is not even solved.
Cool. To be resolved on Twitter. Thank you, panelists.